So today we are starting the skeletal system. The skeletal system lectures are divided into three parts. Part one is going to be looking at the physiology of the skeleton. Part two will focus on the bones of the skeleton. And then part three will be looking at the joints of our skeleton and how it moves. So today we're going to start by talking about skeletal cartilage. So when you are born, most of your skeleton is made of cartilage, and as you get older, that cartilage changes to bone. So we begin to form bone as we start reaching adolescence, and then as we become adults, we have very little cartilage found, and it's only found in areas where we need a lot of flexible tissue. So remember that our skeleton is made of a variety of cartilages, and that cartilage itself consists mainly of water, and that's what allows it to spring back to its original shape. If you'll remember back to tissues, we learned that cartilage is about 80% water, and so that's what allows it to have that flexibility. Also remember that skeletal cartilage has no nerves and it's avascular, so there are no blood vessels, which means when you damage cartilage, you don't feel it and it doesn't bruise or swell. The cartilage itself is surrounded by something known as the perichondrium. The perichondrium is a very tough but flexible connective tissue, and it serves as a girdle. It resists expansion, so it makes the skeletal cartilage stay the thickness that it's supposed to be and not allow it to squeeze out from between the bones as they're put under pressure. The perichondrium is vascular. It does have blood vessels, and that's what delivers nutrients to the cartilage so that it can grow and get the things that it needs in order to remain homeostatic. Remember that there are three types: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage, which of course we learned those in our tissues unit. So here's a picture of the skeleton, and you'll see that the different types of cartilage are depicted by different colors. So this dark purple, that's our hyaline cartilage, and you'll see we have a large amount of hyaline cartilage. This light purple, this is elastic cartilage that's found in a few of our areas. And then this reddish color fibrocartilage, you'll see that there's some of it right here in the vertebral column and in a few other places within the skeleton. So cartilage, when it is growing, it grows two ways. One way is appositional growth, which means that our cartilage-forming cells, those chondrocytes, chondroblasts, they secrete new cartilage on the outside of our original old cartilage. Interstitial growth, the cartilage forms the cells or the new cartilage matrix on the inside of our old cartilage. But remember that cartilage growth ends during adolescence when our skeleton stops growing, which means that once we've reached adolescence, all the cartilage we have is all the cartilage we'll ever have. So we have to be very careful with it. And do remember that cartilage is not bone. It is very different from bone. It's a very different tissue type, and it has a very different function compared to bone. So now let's move into how we classify our bones. We have 206 named bones of the skeleton, and this is our very general skeletal diagram that you've already received, and you should be studying. Remember that I do count spelling on this test for this diagram and for all of your diagrams in this unit because it's important that you know how to spell these bones. And there's a picture of this in the Google Classroom so that you can zoom in or print out if you would like it. There are also extra copies of the blank diagram in the Google Classroom as well as on the website that you can go and pull up, print out, and you can practice for your skeletal diagram test. So obviously there are not 206 bones labeled here on this diagram because when we get to the second part of this unit, we'll begin to learn the specific bones that are the specific names that are given to bones like within the hand or within the feet, because each phalange has its own name, each metacarpal has its own name. So we'll be going through those as we get to part two. Now, bones are divided up in the skeleton in two major places. And we've already learned this when we started in Unit 1. We learned that we have an axial portion to our body. Well, that axial portion has an axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton is just like the axial portion, but it's just the bones. So instead of head, neck, trunk, we say skull, vertebral column, and rib cage. And these bones are important because they protect us. Remember, there's a lot of very important vital organs that are found in our head, in our chest cavity. And so the axial skeleton, its job is to protect those, support them, and carry them around within our body. Now, the second portion of the body was our appendicular portion. And so our appendicular portion has a skeleton as well. Those would be our upper and lower limbs. So our arms and our legs. And then, of course, the girdles, which would be our shoulders and hips. And then, of course, included in that, you're going to find your wrist, your hands, your fingers, your foot, your ankle, your toes. So there are a lot of bones in the appendicular skeleton. And the main purpose of the appendicular skeleton is for locomotion, so that we can move and we can manipulate our body as we need to. This picture is kind of an interesting one. This is a picture of a hip replacement. So if you ever heard of someone or know someone that's had to have their hip replaced, this is what it looks like when they do that hip replacement. So we have so many bones. One way that we classify bones is by their shape and by their size. So the shape is pretty important because the shape fulfills a specific need. And when we classify the bones, we typically classify them by their shape. And then, of course, as we're looking within that classification, we'll look at their size in comparison. And there's a lot of different shapes and sizes out there. So we have long bones. Long bones are going to be longer than they are wide, and they're named for their shape, not for their size. So like, for instance, our fingers, the little phalanges, those are actually considered long bones because if you feel your finger, you'll feel that that bone is longer than it is wide. So even though it's a small bone, it still has that long shape. And so that's why we give it the name or give it the classification of a long bone. Now, short bones are typically cube shaped, meaning that they're about as wide as they are all the way around. And so we find those in like our wrist and our ankle. Those are considered short bones. There are some short bones that can be rounded, kind of a sesame seed shape, and our kneecap would fall into that category because our kneecap kind of has a sesame seed shape. So that would be our patella, would be considered a short bone. Then we have flat bones. Flat bones are just flat. They're usually pretty thick. They're flattened out, and a lot of our flat bones have a curvature to them. Some examples of flat bones would be our sternum, so the breastbone, your scapula, your shoulder blade. The ribs are flat bones, and if you think about if you've ever eaten ribs, when you get down to the bone of the rib, you'll notice that it's kind of got this flattened shape. And then our skull is considered flat bones, even though it curves around. When you look at the skull, the bone is pretty flat all the way around. And then we've got some weirdos, and the weirdos just get lumped into irregular bones. These are bones that just have very complicated shapes. They don't fit anywhere else. And so examples of those would be like our vertebrae. The vertebrae all have very different shapes depending on where it is in the backbone or within your vertebral column. So the vertebrae are irregular, and then your hips are irregular bones. And later on, when you look at the skeleton and you look at some three-dimensional pictures, you'll understand why those are considered irregular. So here's a picture of some of the classifications of the bones, and you do have in the Google Classroom a coloring sheet that goes through the classification of the bones, and so you'll color the individual bones that they've pulled out of the skeleton, whatever color scheme that you choose, but you're also going to color the entire skeleton on that coloring sheet as well, and that's going to help you to really understand how we classify bones. So that's where we're going to stop for this first lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.